G'day ladies and gents, and welcome to Microsoft Flight Simulator 2020. So this will be my first video on the sim, and we have a bit to talk about here, but first, today's flight. We'll be flying from YSCB-Canberra to YSSY-Sydney in the Diamond Aircraft DA62. The flight's going to take about 45 minutes real time, although we're going to edit this down a little bit, and we're just going to be having a little bit of a chat as the flight goes on. So, as we line up here, ready to take off, just a couple of things about my visuals. I'm running at 3440 by 1440. My PC stats are in the video description down below. I'm running a 2700X over a GTX 1080 Ti with 32 gigs of RAM, running everything off of an SSD. Frame rate in simulation varies between 30 and about 75 FPS depending on exactly where I am in the world. Obviously it's lower if I'm closer to a major city or an area of high activity. If I'm out in the middle of the open, say flying over the Aussie outback, significantly higher frame rates as you would expect. Graphical settings are near maxed out with only motion blur disabled. Just accelerating up to rotation speed. The rotation speed of the DA62 is actually about 76 knots, but she was feeling a little nose heavy on this flight, so I sort of just gave her a little bit of stick back and just waited until she lifted herself, which is at about 90 instead. A little faster than I should be going, but it was when she wanted to go. Anyways, now we're up, we're going to roll off to the left, and we're going to go and take a look at Canberra. Now the reason why I chose Canberra as a starting point for my first video, and Sydney as my ending point, is they represent two cities on opposite ends of the scale. So I should begin by saying Microsoft Flight Simulator 2020 is without a doubt the single best looking flight simulator currently on the market, or soon to be on the market. It is stunning to look at. I'll just have to wait for ATC to go through. This is all in post-commentary, by the way. So I'm just going to give a quick respond. ATC gets really testy if you don't give them a call back whenever they
Canberra
speak
Tower
to you.
Med Air 069er, continue for south departure.
Alright, so as I was saying, best looking flight simulator on the market, or soon to be on the market, but it's not perfect. In the end, all of the terrain that you see is based on satellite photography taken from Bing Maps that has then been processed by the Azure AI on the cloud and is then streamed down to your PC. The quality of the environments is based entirely on the quality of the satellite photography, which is not uniform. It does vary. Some areas, including some capital cities, actually have rather low quality satellite photography, or worse than that, they may actually be broken up into composite shots from different satellites taken at completely different times at completely different quality settings. This satellite data then gets fed into the Azure AI, which has to process it and do its best to try and make a functioning city that looks like the real one and place it on the map. Sometimes this misses the mark.
You are leaving my airspace, frequency change approved.
Just waiting for the acknowledgement here before I continue. This one was a little bit slow for some reason. ATC was very laggy around Canberra.
Canberra Tower Med Air 069er, frequency change.
Alright, so we're going to head around the back of Telstra Tower here, then we're going to head up to Capitol Hill and do a couple of orbits around Parliament House. And I want you to take a really good look at Canberra from the air, because this is stunningly accurate. I'm not entirely sure exactly how much handcrafted work was done in Canberra. I'm not entirely sure on how much is done on the cities. I only really know about the airports that Asobo has been working on. But this is pretty bloody close. The trees in the background, just off our nose there at the moment, are probably a little bit too tall, but that's actually a problem with the auto-generation or auto-placement of trees in the sim as it currently stands. They are a little bit too tall. In a couple of places you're getting trees that are closing on 200 feet to 300 feet tall, entire rainforests and forests of them, which is a bit excessive. Tree placement in general in the sim is a little bit excessive as well, although it doesn't bother me too much, providing the trees don't start blocking off the ends of runways, which does happen in some of the bush plane runways that you can get in the middle of nowhere. But anyways, getting off point here. Coming up on Capitol Hill and Parliament House. Now, Parliament House was definitely handcrafted, because it is a very unique building design, as you'll see. I don't know how many of you watching actually know what Australia's, well, essentially the head of our parliament looks like. It is a kind of beautiful building. It's a shame that it's full of politicians, really. But, yeah, that had to be handcrafted. Now, as you watch as it comes around, compare the shot up on the top right, which is real, to what you're seeing. Pause if you have to. All the buildings, all the roads line up, all the trees are about right, the general placement of everything is just about perfect, and this goes out and extends out for most of Canberra. Couple of spots it's a little fiddly, as I said, the tall trees off of one side, and there's some pretty low poly buildings or low quality buildings in a couple of places, but for the most part, everything seems to be right on the money. This is what Canberra looks like from the air. And this is standard. You get this in the sim at default. This alone is amazing. Actually, been a couple of years since I've been to Canberra. I really need to come back at some point. There's a great museum up here. Check out the Lancaster again. So just doing a little bit of a dive through here, and we're going to fly low out to the other side of Canberra, cross back over Lake Burley Griffin, and we're going to climb up past the Australian Defence Force Academy, and then head around the north end of the runway and start making our way towards Wollongong and then Sydney. Now, this, as I said, is beautifully accurate. There's a couple of low quality buildings over here. For the most part, everything is exactly where it should be, and I will do the night lighting on this at some point as well. The night lighting for Canberra is nothing short of stunning. Just having a little bit of fun. Those of you who are regulars to my channel know exactly what altitudes I enjoy flying at. For those of you who are new, who are just here for the 2020 content, expect me to low fly regularly. It's kind of what I do. Anyways, that off the left is the Australian Defence Force Academy. That is one of the marshalling yards, and you should see the parade ground coming up just underneath the engine, under the left engine at the moment. It'll pop up out the back right now. So yeah, if you're Australian and you're thinking about going to the military and becoming an officer, you're probably going to go there. That's done true. Alright, so from here we're going to head to the northeast, and we're going to head out over Lake George and into the Woodlawn Wind Farm, which is also placed and, well, worth taking a quick look at while we're on our way. We've got to head that direction anyway. So, anyways, that is Canberra. And as I said, I'm not entirely sure how much handcrafting was done. Capitol Hill and Parliament House, definitely handcrafted. I would assume the two rings around it for the main central buildings and the donut was probably all handcrafted as well. Outside of that, I'm not entirely sure what was autogen and what was handcrafted, but autogen or not, actually I should probably clarify myself here a little bit as well, because autogen can actually mean a couple of things. Whenever I'm referring to autogen in this video, I'm referring to generated by the Azure AI automatically based on satellite data. If I'm speaking about anything else, I'm talking about handcrafted, which means the developers themselves have deliberately messed with the generated data in order to make it more realistic, added custom buildings, added custom items, played with terrain meshes and so on in order to make the area look great. So I'm not entirely sure how much of Canberra was handcrafted. I know the central portion was. I think the rest of the city was autogen, but it was done on high enough quality satellite photography that the autogen is about as good as I've seen. It is bloody well done. Sydney misses the mark in a couple of areas, although to be fair, this is still in beta, and I suspect that Sydney is still a work in progress at this point, because, well, you'll see when we get there. Also, why we encounter the only clouds that we will encounter for this entire flight we should probably talk quickly about the weather systems. I will show them off in other videos. I flew this in real time and real weather conditions, and unfortunately this was really all the weather that I had. It was nothing short of a beautiful day for flying this particular time. But the weather system in Microsoft Flight Simulator 2020 is nothing short of astounding as well, as I'm sure you've seen in other videos and you will see further in mine. The storms in particular are absolutely incredible and actually scary to fly into, which is beautiful. Anyways, that is Lake George coming up just ahead of us at the moment, and if you look in the distance you'll start seeing the Woodlawn wind farm. Now, I can't vouch for the placement of the wind generators here, but they are the right type and around the right size. I just don't know 100% about the placement. I have never been there. Alright, so the aircraft within the sim. Now, we need to start off by saying that these are not study level aircraft. They are high fidelity level aircraft. They are clickable in the cockpit and they do require systems management, but they are not full study sims. But that's fine. And almost no flight sim on the market that I can actually think of has a fully functional study level aircraft available as default. So, what have we got here? Well, you've got quite a number of extremely high quality, high fidelity aircraft. Currently, as it stands in the beta, there's a couple that need flight model tweaks, a couple that need some systems and internal adjustment, things like fuel consumption's a little bit too high or a system isn't quite working the way it should, but most of the key pieces are there and they just need a few adjustments. I'm not too worried about those. I'm pretty sure they'll all be done within the time frame that we have. Most, like the Diamond here, are perfectly fine. Everything functions, everything reacts as I would expect it to. I've been able to use the real G1000 manuals in order to learn some of the avionics functionality, so that's all being modelled as it should be. There is obviously some clear systems that aren't. If you put your mouse cursor over a system that is not modelled, it'll just bring up a small tag saying inoperable. But for default simulation aircraft, they are quite acceptable. I can't speak too much in regards to the A320 and the 747. I know those are two that people are probably going to be very interested in, but I don't fly a lot of airliners. My interest is mainly, as I said before, in general aviation, small aircraft, everything up to small business jets. I will fly the odd airliner every now and again, but they are not my area of expertise or interest, so I will let those who are far more experienced on that speak in regards to those. I like to play around with general aviation aircraft. They're a hell of a lot more fun. And speaking of which, we might actually do a little bit of a jump forward in time once we get up to Kangaroo Valley, because this whole level flying thing got the better of me and I had to go for a little bit of a low altitude run. But anyways, I realise I'm running off just points of interest that you may have already heard about specific parts of this sim already. So to really explain how good this is, I really need to describe my first flight. So, as I said, I've been on the alpha for a while, so this was from an alpha quite a ways back. And like everybody, my first time flying in Microsoft Flight Simulator, the first thing I went and did is found my house. This is almost the golden rule of Microsoft Flight Simulator. The first thing you are going to do when you get into this flight sim is go and find your house, because everything is based on satellite data. If your house is in a satellite photo, your house is in this sim, likely as an individual building that you will be able to pick out. But it's a little bit more complex than that for me, because you see, I live in rural Victoria. Now, I'm not sure how many of you have done flight simming in the past and happen to have flown some of the more rural and outback sections of Australia, but for those of you who haven't, it's generally a flight sim wasteland. The town I live in is not small. it has a few thousand people in it. Well, it's a small town by standards of everything that's around it, but there is a few thousand people here. It's not something that you will easily miss. Yet on every single other flight simulator, the very best, which is X-Plane 11, by default, my town was not marked. Or at least not marked by anything too noticeable. My town was a crossroads with 5 buildings on it. That's all it is. It does not exist within the sim. None of the landmarks for anywhere within about 50 to 60 kilometers in any direction of my house actually exists either. The nearest runway to my house, which is about 40 kilometers away, 40 to 45 kilometers away, depending on exactly which way you want to travel, well, it's got a pretty main, two-way bitumen road that runs right alongside of it, which is a dirt track that only partially exists within X-Plane, and it's, as I said, X-Plane has the best modelling for my area by default. If I want to fly VFR up until this point in a flight sim, I have had to spend hundreds on custom terrains, finding freeware mods that I can put in as well, and then custom tweaking them in order to be able to actually recreate my area. And it is not accurate by any way, shape or form, but at least my town is represented and the runway is represented correctly. It was always a huge effort, so I generally just didn't bother flying in Australia because it was just, I couldn't do VFR flying around my area. It was impossible. The landmarks didn't exist, some of the roads didn't exist, and whole towns didn't exist. First time jumping into Microsoft Flight Simulator 2020. I didn't know how to change the time, and the download didn't complete until 11 o'clock at night. So this was a night flight. Jumped into a Cessna, straight onto my local airport, parked in the correct position. Was able to take the correct taxiways as they exist onto the runway and take off. Sure enough, the roads are exactly where they should be. The entire city that runway is next to is modelled accurately enough that I can pick out the streets by name. Building colours weren't quite right, but everything was there, including a couple of landmarks that I've never seen modelled before in that side of that city as well. Followed the roads out and was able to fly straight to my front door at night, VFR, with no mapping. I was flying the analog Cessna, so none of this G1000 stuff inside, and I wasn't looking at the gauges because I wasn't exactly sure where the light switches were to turn them on, so I couldn't read them. Nighttime VFR navigation to my front door in a stock sim that was still in alpha. That has never happened before, ever. I have never seen terrain this good in Australia, and I have never been able to fly VFR in my area without spending days to weeks modding the hell out of the flight simulation in order to make it possible to do. And I can do it anywhere in Australia. There is no wasteland here. As far as I know, there's no wasteland anywhere on the world. If you know of other areas that may be close to you, there's probably some other people that live rural in other parts of the world that are watching this, that are thinking, yeah, that sounds a lot like my area, trying to go and fly. It doesn't exist. You can VFR everywhere, and that was the goal of Microsoft Flight Simulator in the end. They wanted to make a simulation that was accurate enough visually that you could do visual flight anywhere in the world out of the box. And they've already achieved it. That's possible right now and has been for quite some time. It's not perfect, as I said before. There's trees that are in the wrong places, probably too many trees, the sizes are out, there's occasional terrain glitches, sometimes things just don't look right. But even when they're not right, they're still accurate enough that you can visually fly through the area and navigate just off landmarks that you know. And that alone is just incredible. I honestly don't think, for the flying that I've done at the moment, and I've spent a lot of time in Microsoft Flight Simulator 2020 since I got access to the alpha, I don't think there is any truly bad terrain in this flight simulator. It ranges somewhere between jaw-droppingly beautiful to adequate. But there is nothing lower than that anywhere in the flight sim that I have seen. But that does beg the question. What does that mean for third-party terrain developers and environment developers that we've seen in other sims? Well, does it mean that they're out of a business now? Well, no, not at all. There is always room to improve, and handcrafted will always beat what the Azure AI can put together, no matter how good what the Azure AI manages to put together looks. What it does mean, though, is it's just no longer required. In the past, as I was sort of saying with my story, if I wanted to fly VFR in rural Victoria and some other parts of Australia, I had to get custom scenery and custom terrains, either pay for it or find free third-party mods or put together a combination of the two, generally both because I didn't have enough areas that were covered, in order to be able to get a terrain that I can fly VFR in. Now I don't have to, but there are still places that I would be happy to throw a few dollars to get an airport that looks exactly like the real airport, or a city that looks exactly like the real city. The need for both free community-created and paid-for environments still exists, but now the quality just has to be really raised because the base game already looks pretty good, so you've got to do better than that. And welcome to the southern outskirts of Sydney. So, before we go into land, we're actually going to do a lap around Sydney in order to check out where the bridge should be and where the Opera House is. Now, I think a lot of the problems that Sydney actually has at the moment is it hasn't been touched at all by handcrafting outside of placing the Opera House. The Opera House is obviously a handcrafted asset, and it has been placed where it should be. The bridge has not been placed at this point. The bridge is not there. And I think the city itself is completely running off, well, multiple shots of satellite footage, and I think that's what's causing a bit of an issue here. To give you an idea, Sydney is 12,368 kilometres squared in ground coverage if you count in Greater Sydney. This means this area is likely split by a couple of different satellite photographs, so the AutoGen, the Azure AI, is having to work over multiple shots in order to try and get this together, and the quality is obviously varying a little bit. The terrain mesh is a little bit out too. Sydney is fairly hilly, but there are some particularly large hills that don't exist. There are some incredibly large trees, which I will point out, and as I said, at this point in time, the Sydney Harbour Bridge is currently missing in action. So I'm going to jump from the outskirts here because it will take us about 5 or 6 minutes to actually get to the CBD from here, even by air, and jump over to the turn-in for the Sydney Harbour Bridge. Alright, so from here we'll be coming over Birchgrove Oval and Snails Bay, coming down on the Opera House. You can just see it there off the right, and that is meant to be the Sydney Harbour Bridge. So at the moment we only have a generic bridge in place, we don't have the actual bridge. I'm sure it's sitting in some asset builder's computer at the moment being worked on, and it probably will be inserted before release. I'm not too worried about that yet, it's just not present at this point. But there is a couple of other issues in the area. Once we get really close down, you'll start to notice that there are terrain glitches on the shoreline. Water is not quite where it should be, and then just the general scale of the trees. This is what Sydney Harbour should look like. It doesn't have a forest behind the Opera House. It does have a little park area, but that's about it. And yeah, these are not small trees. There's 100-metre gum trees everywhere. So that's part of the tree placement. That needs to be toned down and controlled a little bit. The terrain glitches are more of an issue because the first thing people are going to do when they get into something like an A5, if they're flying down this end of the world, is try and land between Sydney Harbour Bridge and the Opera House. And there are terrain glitches and glitches in the water around the back and leading up towards the docks to the right-hand side of the Opera House. And you'll see terrain glitches starting to pop in on the spit up ahead. You'll also see parts of the terrain are underwater with buildings sitting in the water. The Sydney area is an example of something that is probably poorer quality satellite imagery ran through the Azure AI, and it's doing its best to try and make something of it. But it's the kind of thing that will need a manual touch in order to correct it. Now, to be clear, I'm not having a huge complaint about this. For the most part, Sydney is still better than most cities that I've seen in most flight simulators. It's just one that I happen to notice the glitches because, you know, I've been here before and I'm sort of looking for them to begin with. If you swap the bridge out, which, as I said, I'm sure the bridge is sitting on somebody's computer at the moment and ready to be replaced, fly over this at 10,000 feet and you probably wouldn't notice it, especially if you've never been to Sydney before. It would probably look beautiful. But it is an example of, if you go looking for issues, you will find them, because the sim isn't perfect. But even not being perfect, short of the missing bridge, that's still a pretty beautiful representation of Sydney.
Sydney Tower Med Air 069er is 6 miles northeast with golf to land. Med Air 069er, Sydney Tower, enter left downwind runway tree 4 left, altimeter 29er, wind 127 at 14. Med Air 069er, did you copy?
Alright, so from here we're just about to turn in right, flaps down and gear down to come in for landing. But as we're coming in on our approach, one last thing to cover. The actual streaming of data itself. Exactly how much data does get streamed down? Well, that will vary. It'll vary based on where you fly. The more complex cities you fly near, the larger population centres you fly near, the more towns you fly over, the more complex environments you fly over, and the areas of higher traffic you fly in, the more data you're going to have to stream, obviously. The quieter, more rural areas, the more lower density areas you fly in, the less data you'll have to stream. Now, in the options menu, there is a tool that counts exactly how much you have downloaded, and you can put restrictions on it if you've got data limitations, or stop it from streaming altogether if you want it to, but it will keep a track of exactly how much data you have streamed down in the time that you've been playing. So at this point in time, at the time of recording, I have done around 13 hours in Microsoft Flight Simulator 2020 since the release of this beta. Since the release of this beta, I've also downloaded 24 gig of streaming data. So I'm averaging just under 2 gig an hour, or 2 gig per flight hour of streaming data for the way that I fly in the areas that I happen to fly in. This will vary depending on how you fly, where you fly, and what your settings are on your end, but it should give you a rough idea on exactly what the consumption is. So you can put limits if you do have data caps as well. You can put limits. You can pre-download sections of the environment if you wish. You can also run with the streaming data turned off using just the default auto-gen. Now, the default auto-gen, well, it's still better than what you'll see in a lot of current flight simulators, but it is much more in line with what they look like, because it's using a very similar technology in order to save space. I was getting a little bit of a twitch in the nose the whole way down on approach. I had the landing trim set up slightly wrong, I think. But, touchdown. And then immediately slide off to the left and almost lose control because, yeah, I do that. Anyways, that has been our flight from Canberra to Sydney. We're now down at Sydney International Airport. We're down the far end of the main runway. I'm not actually sure why ATC directed us to this one. This is the runway that is normally used for... Yeah, it's the runway that's normally used for landing international airliners, so it is a long drive up to the terminal, but we're going to take the right off here anyway and go find a place to park. Anyways, ladies and gents, I hope you enjoyed the video, and thank you very much for watching. There will be more Microsoft Flight Simulator coming to the channel very, very soon. I am looking forward to putting my next flight up already. The next ones are probably going to be live comms flights. I'm just going to generally have a little bit of a chat and just fly some interesting areas, probably just around Australia to start with. That's requesting ground for taxi. But yeah, otherwise, if there's any particular areas that you would like to see me fly, and let me know in the comment section down below. And until next time, remember to click that like button if you did, share and subscribe if you want to see more, and as always, take care.